M. Adams, a strict elementary school teacher, humiliates a disabled black boy named Mary, shattering his confidence in front of the entire class, but just 9 minutes later the tables turn and she's the one crying for mercy as the consequences of her actions come crashing down. Can she undo the damage she caused, or has her cruel behavior sealed her fate for good? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story don't forget to subscribe. M. Adams stood at the front of her 6th grade classroom, her steely gaze sweeping over the rows of desks. Her lips were pressed into a thin line and her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She tapped her foot impatiently, waiting for the last stragglers to take their seats. Quiet down, class. She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. We have a lot to cover today, and I won't have any disruptions. As the students scrambled to sit up straight and pull out their textbooks, Miss Adams couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. After 20 years of teaching, she found herself increasingly irritated by the daily chaos of managing a classroom full of pre-teens. Her eyes landed on Mary, the black boy in the wheelchair at the back of the room. She felt her jaw clench involuntarily. Mary always seemed to need extra time, extra explanations, extra everything. It was exhausting, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding the entire class back. Today we'll be starting a new unit on fractions, Miss Adams announced, turning to write on the blackboard. As she scribbled equations, her mind wandered to the stack of ungraded papers on her desk. She used to love teaching, finding joy in helping young minds grow. But now it felt like a never-ending cycle of lesson plans, discipline issues, and accommodations for students who just couldn't keep up. She turned back to face the class, her eyes narrowing as she noticed Mary fumbling with his textbook. Mary, she said, her voice tinged with impatience, we don't have all day. Please try to keep up with the rest of the class. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others cast sympathetic glances toward Mary. Miss Adams ignored the tension in the room, pushing forward with her lesson. She told herself it was for the greater good. She couldn't let one student slow down the progress of 20 others. As she launched into her explanation of numerators and denominators, Miss Adams felt a familiar sense of resentment bubbling up inside her. She remembered a time when she would have gone out of her way to help a struggling student, but those days were long gone now. She just wanted to get through each day with as little hassle as possible. Any questions? She asked, her tone making it clear she didn't really want any. When no hands went up, she nodded curtly. Good, now open your workbooks to page 37 and complete exercises 1-10. You have 15 minutes. As the students bent over their desks, Miss Adams sat down heavily in her chair. She glanced at Marky again, watching as he struggled to maneuver his wheelchair closer to his desk. For a moment, she felt a flicker of guilt, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let herself get bogged down by every student with special needs. Still, as she began grading papers, Miss Adams couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. She had become the kind of teacher she used to despise, cold, unforgiving, and blind to the individual needs of her students. But what else could she do? The system was broken, and she was just trying to survive in it. As the class filed out for recess, Mary carefully maneuvered his wheelchair through the narrow aisle between desks. His classmates patiently waited, offering encouraging smiles as he made his way to the door. Despite the daily challenges he faced, Mary's kind heart and quiet determination had earned him many friends. Come on, Mary, his friend Jake called from the hallway. We're going to play basketball today. Mary's face lit up with excitement. I'm coming, he replied, his voice filled with enthusiasm as he wheeled himself out of the classroom. M. Adams watched with a frown. She sighed heavily, gathering her papers for the next lesson. The sight of Mary's wheelchair always brought a twinge of frustration to her already stressed mind. Out on the playground, Mary joined his friends near the basketball court. They had developed a system where Mary could participate by being the designated passer, using his strong arms to throw the ball to his teammates. All right, Marky cheered Mia as he made a perfect pass to her. Nice throw. Mary beamed with pride, feeling like a valuable part of the team. For a moment he forgot about the challenges he faced every day, and just enjoyed being a kid playing with his friends. But their game was cut short when M. Adams's sharp voice rang out across the playground. Time's up, everyone back to class. As the students began to file back inside, Mary struggled to keep up. The uneven ground of the playground made it difficult for his wheelchair to move quickly. Miss Adams stood at the door, tapping her foot impatiently. Hurry up, Mary, she called out, her voice tinged with irritation. We can't delay the whole class for you. Mary's cheeks burned with embarrassment as he pushed himself harder, his arms straining against the wheels of his chair. His classmates slowed their pace, wanting to walk alongside him, but Miss Adams urged them inside. The rest of you get to your seats, she said firmly. We have a lot to cover before the end of the day. As Mary finally reached the classroom door, out of breath and with sweat beading on his forehead, Miss Adams barely concealed her frustration. She held the door open with one hand, her other clutching a stack of worksheets. "You need to find a way to keep up, Marky," she said, her voice low and stern. "Your classmates can't always wait for you." Marky nodded silently, his earlier joy from the playground fading away. He wheeled himself to his desk, feeling the weight of Miss Adams's disapproving gaze on his back. As the lesson began, Mary tried his best to focus, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being a burden. He noticed M. Adams's eyes flickering to his wheelchair more than once, her mouth set in a tight line of displeasure. The following day, the class gathered in the gymnasium for their PE lesson. Miss Adams stood at the front, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the students as they lined up. When Mary wheeled himself and she pursed her lips, her frustration already visible. "All right, class," Miss Adams announced, her voice sharp. "Today we're doing an obstacle course. I expect everyone to give their best effort." The students began to move through the course, climbing over low walls, crawling under nets, and weaving between cones. Mary watched anxiously. Knowing he couldn't participate in most of these activities, M. Adams approached him, her face stern. "Mary, you can do the parts. You're able to use your arms to pull yourself along the mat for the crawling section." Mary nodded, determined to try his best. He maneuvered his wheelchair to the starting point and began to make his way through the course. His classmates cheered him on, but Ms. Adams's impatience grew with each passing moment as Mary struggled to pull himself along the mat, his arms trembling with effort. M. Adams's frustration boiled over. "Come on, Mary," she snapped. "You're holding up the entire class." Mary's face flushed with embarrassment. He tried to move faster, but his arms were already tired. Sweat bead on his forehead as he pushed himself harder. Miss Adams stood over him, her shadow looming. "This is ridiculous," she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you can't keep up, maybe you shouldn't be in this class at all." The gym fell silent. Mary's classmates exchanged uncomfortable glances, shocked by their teacher's cruel words. Mary stopped moving, his head bowed as he fought back tears. Miss Adams wasn't finished. She gestured to the rest of the class, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look at your classmates, Marky. They're able to participate properly. Why can't you do the same?" Mary's shoulders began to shake as he tried desperately to hold back his sobs. He wanted nothing more than to disappear, to escape the harsh words and judging eyes. His classmates shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others glaring at M. Adams, but no one spoke up. The silence in the gym was deafening, broken only by Mary's muffled sniffles. Miss Adams stood there, her arms crossed, seemingly unaware of the impact her words had on Mary and the rest of the class. The once lively PE lesson had turned into a painful display of cruelty, leaving everyone feeling helpless and ashamed. As the tension in the gymnasium reached its peak, a figure stood silently in the shadows near the entrance. Mrs. Harris, a parent volunteer who had been helping out in the school library, had come to deliver a message to M. Adams. Instead, she found herself frozen in place, witnessing a scene that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Harris watched in horror as Ms. Adams berated Mary, her harsh words echoing through the silent gym. The woman's hands trembled as she saw the young boy's shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, a teacher, someone entrusted with nurturing young minds, crushing a child's spirit so callously. Her heart ached for Mary and anger bubbled up inside her. Mrs. Harris knew she couldn't stand by and let this continue. With a determined set to her jaw, she quietly slipped out of the gymnasium, her mind made up. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she strode purposefully towards the administrative offices. Mrs. Harris's face was flushed with a mix of anger and concern, her eyes bright with unshed tears of frustration. As she approached the principal's office, Mrs. Harris took a deep breath to steady herself. She knocked firmly on the door, her resolve strengthening with each passing second. She knew what she had to do. She had to be Mary's voice, to stand up for him when no one else would come in. Called a voice from inside the office. Mrs. Harris opened the door, her expression grave. "Principal Wilson," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "I need to speak with you immediately. It's about M. Adams and a student named Mary. What I've just witnessed in the gymnasium is absolutely unacceptable." Back at the classroom, a heavy silence hung in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the students' faces. Mary sat at his desk, his head bowed low, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the smooth surface. He couldn't bring himself to look up, afraid of meeting the eyes of his classmates. The shame from the PE incident clung to him like a second skin. Mary's cheeks burned as he remembered Miss Adams's cruel words, each one etched into his memory. He wished he could disappear, to sink into the floor and vanish from sight around him. His classmates fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats. They snuck glances at Mary, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and unease. Amy, Mary's friend, sat a few desks away, her heart aching for him. She wanted to reach out to offer some words of comfort, but fear held her back. M. Adams's stern presence loomed large in the room, and Amy, like the others, was too scared to speak up. The next morning, at the front of The classroom Miss Adams carried on with her lesson as if nothing had happened. Her voice droned on about fractions and decimals, but her eyes kept darting to Mary's hunched form. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face each time she looked at him, as if his very presence was a disruption to her carefully planned lesson. "Mary," Miss Adams called out suddenly, her voice sharp, "please solve this problem." Mary's head snapped up. His eyes wide with fear. The classroom fell even quieter, the tension palpable as everyone held their breath. Adams tapped her foot impatiently. "We don't have all day, Mary. Your disability doesn't exempt you from participating in class." Her words cut through the air like a knife, causing several students to wince. Amy bit her lip, her hands clenched into fists under her desk. She wanted to stand up for her friend, to tell Miss Adams how unfair she was being, but the words stuck in her throat. "Try to be quicker next time," she muttered, just loud enough for Marky to hear. "We can't always wait for you to catch up." Mary's face crumpled at her words, but he fought back, the tears threatening to spill. He reached for the chalk, determined to solve the problem, and returned to the safety of his desk as quickly as possible. Minutes later, the sharp knock on the classroom door cut through Miss Adams's lesson like a knife. All eyes turned to see Mr. Wilson, the principal, standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of seriousness, his usual warm smile nowhere to be seen. "Miss Adams," he said, his voice firm, "I need to see you in my office immediately." A ripple of whispers spread through the classroom. Miss Adams's eyebrows furrowed in annoyance. She glanced at the clock, then back at Mr. Wilson. "Can't this wait?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I'm in the middle of an important lawn." Mr. Wilson shook his head. "I'm afraid not. It's urgent." With a huff, Miss Adams put down her chalk and turned to the class. "Continue working on these problems. I'll be back shortly." As she followed Mr. Wilson out of the room, Miss Adams's mind raced. What could be so important? She'd been teaching for decades. Surely this was just another routine check on her methods. The thought of it being anything more serious never crossed her mind. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than usual. The hallways were quiet, their footsteps echoing off the lockers. Mr. Wilson didn't say a word, which only fueled Miss Adams' growing irritation. When they reached the office, Mr. Wilson held the door open for her. As Miss Adams stepped inside, she was surprised to see Mrs. Harris, the teacher volunteer, sitting in one of the chairs. The woman's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Please have a seat." "Miss Adams," Mr. Wilson said, gesturing to the empty chair. Miss Adams sat down, her back straight, her face a picture of impatience. "What's this about?" she asked, looking between Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Harris. Mr. Wilson settled behind his desk, his expression grave. "Miss Adams, we've received a very serious complaint about your behavior towards one of your students." Mary, the color drained from Adams's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Wilson held up a hand. "Mrs. Harris witnessed an incident during your P.E. class," he continued. "She reported that you humiliated and mocked Mary because of his disability." Miss Adams' heart began to race. She hadn't expected this. She looked at Mrs. Harris, who met her gaze with a mixture of disappointment and anger. I was just trying to motivate him," Miss Adams stammered, her usual confidence faltering. Mr. Wilson leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Miss Adams, what Mrs. Harris described goes far beyond motivation. It's discrimination, and it's unacceptable in our school." The gravity of the situation began to sink in. Miss Adams felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. This wasn't a rout and a check, this was serious, and she was in trouble. Mr. Wilson's stern gaze bore into Miss Adams as he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Miss Adams," he began, his voice low and serious, "what Mrs. Harris witnessed in your PE class is completely unacceptable. Mocking a student, especially one with a disability, goes against everything we stand for as educators." Adams shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her usual confidence crumbling. She glanced at Mrs. Harris, who sat silently, her eyes filled with disappointment. I wasn't mocking him," Miss Adams stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to push Mary to do better. He needs to learn that the world won't always accommodate him." Mr. Wilson's frown deepened. "That's not your decision to make, Miss Adams. Our job is to support and encourage all students regardless of their abilities or limitations." Miss Adams felt a surge of frustration. She straightened her back, finding her voice again. "But what about the other students? Mary's disability slows down the entire class. It's not fair to them." The moment the words left her mouth, she knew she'd made a mistake. Mr. Wilson's eyes flashed with anger and Mrs. Harris gasped audibly. "Not fair," Mr. Wilson repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What's not fair is singling out a student and humiliating him in front of his peers. What's not fair is a teacher, someone who should be nurturing and supportive, making a child feel ashamed of something he can't control." Miss Adams felt her cheeks burn with shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Wilson held up his hand, silencing her. "Your job, Miss Adams, is to teach and support all students, not just the ones you deem worthy of your time and effort. Mary deserves the same respect and opportunities as every other child in this school." The weight of Mr. Wilson's Words hit Miss Adams like a ton of bricks. For the first time she began to see her actions through a different lens. The image of Mary's face hurt and embarrassed head flashed through her mind, and a knot formed in her stomach as Miss Adams sat in stunned silence. Mr. Wilson cleared his throat, his expression grave. "There's more, Miss Adams. We've arranged an emergency meeting with Mary's mother, Grace Valera." Miss Adams felt the blood drain from her face. Grace Valera was not just any parent, she was a formidable human rights advocate known throughout the community. More importantly, she was one of the school's biggest donors. "Mrs. Valera," Miss Adams whispered, her voice trembling. "But when she'll be here in an hour," Mr. Wilson replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I suggest you use this time to reflect on your actions and prepare yourself." Miss Adams nodded weakly, her mind racing. She knew Grace Valera's reputation, a woman who fought tirelessly for equality and justice, and now she would be face to face with her, having to explain why she had mistreated her son. As she left Mr. Wilson's office, Adams felt as if the walls were closing in on her. The gravity of the situation hit her full force. This wasn't just about a reprimand or a slap on the wrist. Her entire career could be on the line. She made her way to the teacher lounge, desperate for a moment of solitude. Sinking into a chair, she buried her face in her hands. How had it come to this? She had always prided herself on being a good teacher, strict but fair. When had she crossed the line from maintaining discipline to outright cruelty? The image of Mary's face, hurt and humiliated, flashed through her mind again. This time, instead of irritation, she felt a pang of guilt. She had made a child feel ashamed of something he couldn't control. What kind of teacher did that make her? As the minutes ticked by, Miss Adams's anxiety grew. She knew Grace Valera held significant influence in the school's operations. A word from her could mean the end of Miss Adams's teaching career. The thought made her stomach churn. She tried to gather her thoughts to come up with some explanation for her behavior, but every justification she thought of sounded hollow and selfish in her own ears. How could she possibly defend what she had done? With trembling hands, Ms. Adams poured herself a glass of water, trying to calm her nerves. She had an hour to prepare, but she felt woefully unprepared for what was to come. The meeting with Grace Valera loomed before her like an insurmountable obstacle, one that could determine the course of her future. That afternoon, Adams took a deep breath and pushed open the door to the meeting room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside. The room felt smaller than she remembered. The air thick with tension. Seated at the table was Grace Valera, Mary's mother. Miss Adams had seen her before at school events but didn't know that she was the mother of Marquis. Grace's presence filled the room with a quiet strength that made Miss Adams feel even more uneasy. Grace looked up as Miss Adams entered, her dark eyes calm but filled with concern. She nodded slightly, gesturing for Miss Adams to take a seat across from her. Adams, Grace said, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice." Miss Adams managed a weak smile as she sat down. Her hands trembled slightly and she clasped them tightly in her lap to hide it. "Of course, Mrs. Valera," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace took a moment before speaking again, her gaze never leaving Miss Adams. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened with my son Mary during your PE class." Adams felt her throat tighten. She opened her mouth to speak, but Grace held up a hand, silencing her gently. "Before we discuss the specifics," Grace continued, "I'd like to share something with you. As an educator, I'm sure you understand the importance of compassion in teaching, especially when it comes to children with disabilities." Miss Adams nodded stiffly, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice warm but serious. "Every child, regardless of their abilities or challenges, deserves to feel valued and respected in the classroom. It's not just about teaching subjects, it's about nurturing young minds and hearts." As Grace spoke, Miss Adams felt a mix of shame and fear wash over her. She knew Grace was right, but the words also reminded her of how far she had strayed from these ideals. "I understand that teaching can be challenging," Grace continued, "but it's in those challenging moments that our compassion matters most. When we show understanding to those who struggle, we teach all our students the value of empathy and inclusivity." Miss Adams finally looked up, meeting Grace's eyes. She was surprised to see not anger but a deep sadness and concern in the other woman's gaze. "Mrs. Valera," Miss Adams began, her voice shaky, I don't know what to say. I never meant to." Grace nodded, encouraging her to continue, but Miss Adams found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain her actions? How could she justify treating a child so cruelly? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and emotions. Adams felt her anxiety growing with each passing second, fearing the worst was yet to come. Grace took a deep breath, her eyes softening as she thought of her son. "Miss Adams, I'd like to tell you a bit more about Mary," she said gently. "He's so much more than the boy you see struggling in PE class." Miss Adams shifted uncomfortably in her seat but nodded, forcing herself to meet Grace's gaze. "Mary has faced challenges since the day he was born," Grace continued. But he's never let his disability define him every day he wakes up. With a smile ready to face whatever comes his way as Grace spoke, her voice filled with pride and love. Last year Mary's class went on a field trip to the Science Museum. The bus wasn't wheelchair accessible, so we had to drive separately. When we arrived, Marky saw his classmates already inside. Do you know what he said to me? Miss Adams shook her head, her curiosity piqued despite her unease. He said, "Mom, I'm just glad I get to go at all. Some kids never get to see cool stuff like this." Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That's the kind of person Mary is. He finds joy in what he can do, not sorrow in what he can't. Adams felt a lump forming in her throat. She had never considered Mary's perspective before. Grace leaned forward, her voice earnest. "Miss Adams, Mary's disability is just one part of who he is. It doesn't define his worth or his potential. As educators, it's our job to see beyond physical limitations and nurture the unique gifts each child possesses." Miss Adams nodded slowly, her mind racing. She thought of all the times she had dismissed Mary, seeing only his wheelchair and not the resilient boy sitting in it. "Did you know Mary loves to draw?" Grace asked. "He spends hours sketching animals and landscapes. His art teacher says he has real talent." Miss Adams blinked in surprise. She had no idea Mary was artistic, and always the first to offer help to his classmates. Grace continued. Last month, when his friend Amy was struggling with math, Mary stayed in during recess to tutor her. As Grace shared these stories, Miss Adams felt a growing sense of shame. She had judged Mary solely on what he couldn't do in PE, ignoring all the wonderful things he could do. "Our job as educators," Grace said softly, "is to see the potential in every child, to nurture their strengths and support them through their challenges. Every student, regardless of their abilities or limitations, deserves that chance to grow and thrive." Miss Adams nodded, her earlier defensiveness giving way to a mix of guilt and realization. She knew Grace was right, but a small part of her still wanted to justify her actions. She had been teaching for so long, surely she knew what was best for her class. But as she looked into Grace's eyes full of love for her son and hope for his future, Miss Adams felt her excuses crumbling away. Miss Adams took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Valera, I want you to know that I never meant to harm Marky," she began, her voice shaky. "I was just trying to encourage him to participate more fully in the class activities." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained silent, allowing Miss Adams to continue. "I admit I was frustrated," Miss Adams confessed, her words tumbling out faster now. "I felt like I wasn't reaching him, and I thought if I pushed him harder he might." She trailed off, realizing how hollow her excuses sounded. Grace leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "Miss Adams, I understand you may have had good intentions, but no child should ever be humiliated for something beyond their control. Mary's disability isn't a choice he made, it's a part of who he is." Adams felt her face flush with shame. Grace's words cut deep, piercing through the protective shell she had built around herself over the years. "Can you imagine how Mary felt in that moment?" Grace continued, her eyes never leaving Miss Adams. "To be singled out, mocked for something he can't change, to have his teacher, someone he should be able to trust, make him feel less than his classmates." Adams's throat tightened. She thought back to the PE class, remembering the hurt in Mar's eyes, the way he had tried to hide his tears. For the first time she truly saw the impact of her actions. I didn't think." Miss Adams stammered, her earlier defenses crumbling. "That's just it, Miss Adams," Grace said gently. "You didn't think about Mary as a person. You saw his disability as an inconvenience, not as a part of a child who deserves respect and understanding." As Grace's words sank in, Adams felt a wave of realization wash over her. She had been so focused on her own frustrations, on maintaining control of her classroom, that she had lost sight of what truly mattered, the well-being of her students. "You're right," Miss Adams whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong." Grace's expression softened as she watched Adams's realization sink in. Instead of the anger or demand for dismissal that Adams had expected, Grace surprised her with an unexpected offer. "Miss Adams," Grace began, her voice calm and measured, "I believe that people can change, but only if they're willing to open their hearts and minds." She paused, making sure she had the teacher's full attention. "Instead of calling for your dismissal, I have a different proposal." Miss Adams looked up, her eyes wide with confusion and a glimmer of hope. "I'd like you to volunteer at the local Center for Children with Disabilities." Grace continued, "It's an opportunity for you to gain a better understanding of the daily challenges these children face." Miss Adams's mouth fell open, slightly caught off guard by this unexpected turn of events. She had been bracing herself for the worst, but here was Grace Valera offering her a chance at redemption. "Mrs. Valera, I don't know what to say," Miss Adams stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace leaned forward, her eyes locked with Adams. "I believe you can change, Miss Adams, but to do that you need to see the world Through Mary's eyes, through the eyes of all the children who face challenges every day, Adams swallowed hard, her mind racing. The thought of Volant in at the center filled her with uncertainty and a touch of fear. She had spent so long distancing herself from students like Mary. And now she was being asked to immerse herself in their world. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, Miss Adams said hesitantly. Grace's voice was firm but kind. That's exactly why you need to do it. This isn't just about Marky anymore, it's about becoming the teacher you once aspired to be. After a long moment of internal struggle, Miss Adams nodded slowly. All right, she said, her voice shaky but resolute. I'll do it. Grace smiled, a look of approval in her eyes. Thank you, Miss Adams. I believe this experience will change you in ways you can't imagine. As Miss Adams left the meeting room, she felt a mix of emotions swirling within her: relief at being given a second chance, fear of the unknown challenges ahead, and a small spark of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She wasn't sure what this experience would entail, but she knew it was a turning point in her life and career. The next morning, Adams stood nervously in front of the Disability Center. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, the weight of her past mistakes heavy on her shoulders. A cheerful receptionist greeted her with a warm smile. You must be Miss Adams. We've been expecting you. I'm Alona. Miss Adams nodded, forcing a small smile. Yes, that's me. Alona led her down a brightly colored hallway, chattering about the center's programs. Miss Adams only half listened, her mind racing with uncertainty. They entered a large room filled with children of various ages, all with different disabilities. Some were in wheelchairs like Mary, others used crutches or walkers, and a few had visible cognitive impairments. Everyone, Alona called out. This is Miss Adams. She'll be volunteering with us for a while. A chorus of hells rang out and Adams felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to such open warmth, especially from children. As she observed the room, Miss Adams felt a growing sense of unease. A young girl with cerebral palsy struggled to pick up a crayon, her face scrunched in concentration. Instead of giving up, the girl kept trying, a determined smile on her face. Nearby, a boy in a wheelchair maneuvered himself expertly around obstacles to join a group playing a board game. His friends made room for him without a second thought, treating him no differently than anyone else. Miss Adams watched as the children went about their activities, each facing their own challenges with a spirit she had never truly appreciated before. She saw their determination, their resilience, and most surprisingly, their joy. A small boy with Down syndrome approached her, holding out a colorful drawing. For you, he said, beaming up at her. Miss Adams took the paper with shaking hands. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As the morning wore on, Miss Adams found herself helping with various activities. She assisted a girl with her physiotherapy exercises, read a story to a group of attentive listeners, and even joined in a modified game of basketball. With each interaction, she felt her preconceptions crumbling. These children, whom she had once viewed as burdens, were showing her a strength of character that left her in awe. By lunchtime, Miss Adams sat in a quiet corner, overwhelmed by what she had experienced. She watched the children laughing, playing, and supporting each other, and felt a deep sense of shame for her past behavior. For the first time, she truly began to understand how limited her view of disability had been. She had seen only the challenges, never the incredible spirit and resilience behind them. As she observed these remarkable children navigating their daily lives with grace and determination, Miss Adams realized she had so much to learn. As the afternoon activities began, Alona approached Miss Adams with a gentle smile. Miss Adams, I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Mal, she said, gesturing to a young boy in a wheelchair nearby. Malik looked up at Miss Adams with bright, curious eyes. His legs, much like Mary's, were thin and motionless beneath a colorful blanket. Despite this, his face radiated warmth and energy. Hi, Miss Adams, Malik chirped, extending his hand. Want to see my cool tricks? Miss Adams hesitated for a moment before taking his small hand in hers. Sure, Malik, what kind of tricks? Without warning, Malik spun his wheelchair in a tight circle, grinning from ear to ear. Tada! I call that one the whirlwind. Adams couldn't help but chuckle, surprised by the boy's enthusiasm. As she spent more time with Malik, she began to see glimpses of Mary in him, the same determination, the same desire to be seen as more than just a disability. Malik showed Adams how he navigated obstacles in his wheelchair, how he adapted games to suit his abilities, and even how he helped younger children with their activities. His energy seemed boundless, his spirit unbreakable. As they worked on a puzzle together, Malik shared stories about his life outside the center, his family, his school, his dreams. Miss Adams listened intently, her heart growing heavier with each word. Sometimes it's hard, Malik admitted, his voice softer now, when other kids stare, or when I can't do everything they can, but my mom says I'm special, that I can do anything if I try hard enough. Miss Adams felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of Mary, of how she had dismissed his efforts and mocked his struggles. The shame she felt was overwhelming. Throughout the afternoon, Miss Adams observed Malik's interactions with other children and staff. She saw how he faced each challenge with determination, how he never let his limitations define him. It was a stark contrast to how she had perceived Mary in her classroom as the day drew to a close. Adams found herself sitting quietly watching Malik laugh with his friends. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: admiration for Malik's resilience, shame for her past actions, and a growing understanding of the daily struggles these children faced. She realized that behind every wheelchair, every pair of crutches, every visible difference, there was a child full of dreams, hopes, and determination, a child who deserved patience, understanding, and respect. Everything she had failed to give Mark. The weight of her realization was almost too much to bear. Miss Adams felt tears prick at her eyes as she finally began to understand the depth of her mistakes and the incredible strength of the children she had so callously dismissed. As the days passed, Adams found herself looking forward to her time at the center. The children's laughter and determination touched her heart in ways she never expected. She watched as they tackled challenges, heeding their spirits unbroken by the obstacles they faced. One afternoon, Miss Adams sat with a group of children during art time. She helped a little girl named Lily, who had limited use of her hands, hold a paintbrush. Lily's face lit up with joy as she created colorful swirls on her paper. "Look, Miss Adams," Lily exclaimed, "I made a rainbow." Miss Adams felt a warmth spread through her chest. "It's beautiful, Lily," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine admiration. As she looked around the room, Adams saw children helping each other, adapting tools to suit their needs, and celebrating each other's achievements. She thought back to her classroom, to Mary, and felt a pang of regret for the times she had failed to see his efforts. During a quiet moment, Miss Adams overheard two boys talking. One of them, Jake, was telling his friend about a tough day at school. "Man, the other kids laughed when I couldn't climb the rope in gym class," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. His friend Tommy patted Jake's shoulder. "Hey, remember what Alona always says? We're all different, but we're all awesome in our own way." Miss Adams felt her eyes well up with tears. She thought of the harsh words she had spoken to Mary, how she had made him feel different and less than his classmates. The realization of the pain she must have caused him hit her like a tidal wave. As the weeks went by, Adams found herself opening up to the children, listening to their stories and sharing in their triumphs. She learned about their dreams, their fears, and their incredible resilience. Each day she felt the hard shell around her heart crack a little more. One day, as she helped Malik with his homework, he looked up at her with a serious expression. "Miss Adams, do you think I could be a teacher someday like you?" Miss Adams felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of how she had once believed children like Malik couldn't achieve such goals. Now, looking into his determined eyes, she saw nothing but possibility. "Malik," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I think you can be anything you set your mind to. You'd make an amazing teacher." As she spoke those words, Miss Adams realized how much she had changed. The prejudices and frustrations that had once clouded her judgment were fading away, replaced by a deep respect for the strength and courage these children showed every day. That night, as Miss Adams drove home, she found herself thinking about Mary. She remembered the hurt in his eyes, the way he had tried so hard despite her harsh words. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she finally understood the depth of her mistakes and the incredible resilience Mary had shown in the face of her cruelty. As Miss Adams drove to school that morning, her heart raced with a mix of nervousness and determination. The past few weeks at the Disability Center had changed her in ways she never thought possible. She parked her car and sat for a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping out. Walking into her classroom, she saw her students with new eyes. Each face held a story, a struggle, a dream. Her gaze lingered on Mary, who was quietly arranging his books on his desk. The sight of him made her heart ache with regret. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice softer than usual. The students looked up, surprised by the change in her tone. Miss Adams took another deep breath. "Before we start today's lesson, I have something important to say." She paused, gathering her courage. "I owe all of you an apology, especially you, Mary." The room fell silent. Mary's eyes widened, and he gripped the arms of his wheelchair tightly. "I've been unfair and unkind," Miss Adams continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I let my frustrations cloud my judgment, and I forgot the most important part of being a teacher, to nurture and support each and every one of you." She walked over to Mary's desk and knelt beside him. "Mary, I'm truly sorry for the way I've treated you. Your disability doesn't define you, and I was wrong to make you feel like it did. You've shown incredible strength and resilience, and I admire that deeply." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes, and he nodded silently, unable to speak. Miss Adams stood up and addressed the entire class. "From now on, things are going to be different. I want this classroom to be a place where everyone feels valued and supported. We're going to learn from each other and celebrate our differences." The students exchanged glances, some looking confused, others hopeful. Amy, Markey's friend, smiled encouragingly at him. "I know it might take time for you to trust me again," Miss Adams said, "but I Promise to do better. I've learned so much in the past few weeks, and I want to share that with all of you. We're going to make this classroom a place where everyone can thrive." As she spoke, Miss Adams felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was committed to becoming the teacher her students deserved. The harsh, impatient woman she had been was fading away, replaced by someone who understood the power of compassion and inclusivity. Miss Adams took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the classroom. The silence was palpable, every student hanging on her words. She knew that moment was crucial, not just for Mary but for all of them. "I want you all to understand," she continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "that my behavior was unacceptable. I've been harsh, impatient, and at times cruel. Each of you deserves better than that." She walked slowly between the desks, making eye contact with each student. When she reached Mary, she paused, her hand resting gently on his desk. "Mary, the first treated you unfairly because of your disability. I saw it as an inconvenience rather than understanding the challenges you face every day. I was wrong, so very wrong." Markey looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Miss Adams felt her own eyes welling up, but she pressed on. "To all of you, I promise to do better. I will be the teacher you deserve, patient, understanding, and supportive. I will celebrate your strengths and help you overcome your challenges. As no student in this class will ever feel left out or less than." Again she returned to the front of the classroom, facing her students with a new sense of purpose. "I know it will take time to rebuild your trust. I'm prepared for that. From today, we're going to create a classroom environment where everyone feels valued and respected. We'll learn together, grow together, and support each other." Miss Adams paused, looking at each face in turn. Some students nodded slightly, while others remained cautious, unsure of this sudden change. "I want you to know that it's okay to make mistakes. I made a big one, and I'm learning from it. That's what I want for all of you too, to learn, to grow, and to become the best versions of yourselves." She walked over to Mary, once more kneeling beside his wheelchair to meet his eyes. "Mary, your strength and resilience have taught me so much. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. Thank you for your patience with me." Markey nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Miss Adams stood up, addressing the class once more. "From now on, we're a team. We'll face challenges together, celebrate victories together, and most importantly, we'll respect and support each other. I promise to lead by example and to be the teacher you all deserve." As Mrs. Adams finished speaking, a hush fell over the classroom. All eyes turned to Mary, waiting to see how he would respond. For a moment the young boy sat quietly, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Then with a deep breath he looked up at Miss Adams, his eyes shining with a wisdom beyond his ears. "Miss Adams," Markey said, his voice soft but clear, "I forgive you." The simplicity and sincerity of his words seemed to echo through the room. Miss Adams felt her breath catch in her throat, overwhelmed by the young boy's grace. Markey continued, his voice growing stronger, "I know it's not always easy to understand what it's like for me, but I'm just trying my best like everyone else. Thank you for saying sorry and for wanting to do better." As he spoke, his classmates listened intently, many of them nodding in agreement. Amy, Mary's friend, reached over and squeezed his hand, a proud smile on her face. M. Adams knelt down beside Mary's desk, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, Mary. Your forgiveness means more to me than you could ever know." The atmosphere in the classroom began to shift. The tension that had hung in the air for so long seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of hope and new beginnings. Students who had been silent observers now began to speak up. "I think it's really brave of you both," said Michael from the back of the class. "It's not easy to say sorry or to forgive." Sarah, another student, chimed in. "Yeah, and it makes me want to be kinder too. We should all look out for each other more." As the students shared their thoughts, Miss Adams stood up, looking around the room with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. She saw smiles where there had once been frowns, open faces where there had been closed-off expressions. "Thank you all," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Mary's forgiveness is a gift, and I promise to honor it every day. Let's all learn from his example and treat each other with more kindness and understanding." The students nodded in agreement, many of them stealing glances at Mary with newfound respect. As for Mary, he sat a little straighter in his wheelchair, a quiet pride evident in his posture. Miss Adams felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy, but with Mary's forgiveness, the class's willingness to move forward, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She looked at her students, no longer seeing obstacles or burdens, but young minds full of potential, each deserving of her best efforts. Next day, Miss Adams nervously smoothed her skirt as she waited outside Grace Valera's office. Her heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear or defensiveness, it was from a genuine desire to share her transformative experience and make amends. When Grace opened the door, her warm smile immediately put Miss Adams at ease. "Please come in," Grace said, gesturing to a comfortable chair. As they settled in, Miss Adams took a deep breath. "Mrs. Valera, I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to volunteer at The Disability Center, it's been life-changing. Grace nodded encouragingly, her eyes kind. I'm glad to hear that. Please tell me about your experience. Miss Adams' words tumbled out filled with emotion. She spoke of Malik and the other children she'd met, their determination and joy in the face of challenges. She described how her perspective had shifted, how she'd come to see the strength in what she once viewed as weakness. I was so wrong, Miss Adams admitted, her voice cracking. About Marky, about all of it. I can't thank you enough for not giving up on me, for showing me a better way. Grace listened intently, her expression softening with each word. When Miss Adams finished, Grace reached out and squeezed her hand. Thank you for being open to change. It takes great courage to confront our own biases. Miss Adams nodded, wiping away a tear. I want to do better, to be better for Mary and for all my students. A spark of inspiration lit up Grace's eyes. You know, Miss Adams, I think we have an opportunity here. What if we worked together to create programs at the school that promote inclusion and support for disabled students? Miss Adams sat up straighter, her face brightening. That would be wonderful. I'd be honored to help in any way I can. Grace smiled broadly. I believe your experience combined with my advocacy work could make a real difference. We could start with awareness workshops for teachers and students, maybe even create a buddy system to foster understanding and friendship. As they began to brainstorm ideas, Adams felt a surge of hope, purpose. She realized that this wasn't just about making amends. It was about creating lasting change that would benefit countless students in the future. With Grace's help and Adams's newfound passion, the school administration embraced the idea of creating new initiatives to support students with disabilities. Principal Wilson called a meeting with the school board where Grace and Miss Adams presented their proposal for a more inclusive educational environment. We have a unique opportunity, Grace explained to the board members, her voice filled with conviction, to create a school where every student feels valued regardless of their abilities. Miss Adams nodded in agreement, adding, as a teacher I've seen firsthand how important it is to address these issues. We can make a real difference in these children's lives. The board members listened intently, impressed by the passion and dedication of both women. After a brief discussion, they unanimously approved the proposal, allocating funds for new programs and resources over the next few weeks. Ms. Adams worked tirelessly alongside Grace to develop these initiatives. They created a comprehensive plan that included awareness workshops for teachers, sensitivity training for students, and a buddy system pairing disabled and non-disabled students. Miss Adams took charge of organizing the teacher workshops, drawing from her recent experiences at the Disability Center. She invited guest speakers including parents of children with disabilities and disability rights advocates to share their perspectives with the staff. Remember, Miss Adams told her colleagues during one session, every child has potential. It's our job to nurture that potential no matter what challenges they face. Grace meanwhile focused on developing the student buddy system. She worked with the school counselor to carefully match students, ensuring that each pairing would be beneficial for both parties. As the initiatives began to take shape, the changes in the school's culture became noticeable. Teachers who had once been hesitant to work with disabled students now approached their roles with renewed enthusiasm and understanding. In the hallways, students could be seen helping their disabled peers, whether it was carrying books or simply offering a friendly smile. The atmosphere of the school shifted, becoming more compassionate and inclusive. Mary in particular flourished under the new programs. His buddy, a kind-hearted boy named Jake, became a close friend, and together they navigated the school day with ease. Miss Adams watched with pride as Mary's confidence grew and he began to participate more actively in class discussions. One afternoon, as Ms. Adams observed a group of students working together on a project, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Grace, smiling warmly. Look at them, Grace said, gesturing to the diverse group of children. This is what we hoped for. Miss Adams nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. It's more than I ever imagined possible, she replied softly. Miss Adams stood at the front of the staff room, her hands trembling slightly as she faced her colleagues. The room was packed with teachers, all curious about the sudden meeting called by Principal Wilson. Miss Adams took a deep breath, steadying herself before she began to speak. I want to share something important with all of you, she said, her voice wavering slightly. It's about my journey and how I've changed as a teacher. The room fell silent as Miss Adams recounted her experience with Mary, the incident that led to her volunteering at the Disability Center, and the profound impact it had on her. She spoke with raw honesty, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I was wrong, she admitted, her voice cracking. I let my frustrations cloud my judgment, and I failed to see the potential in every child. But my time at the center opened my eyes. As she described her interactions with the children at the center, particularly young Malik, her colleagues listened intently. Many of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Recognizing bits of themselves and Ms. Adams's past behavior, these children taught me more than I could ever teach them. Miss Adams continued, her voice growing stronger. They showed me the true meaning of resilience, determination, and joy, and it made me realize that we as educators have a responsibility to nurture every student's potential regardless of their abilities or challenges. Ms. Adams then shared some of the inclusive teaching practices she had learned and implemented in her classroom. She explained how simple adjustments could make a world of difference for students with disabilities. It's not about lowering our standard, as she emphasized, it's about finding creative ways to help every student reach their full potential. As she spoke, Miss Adams could see the impact her words were having on her fellow teachers. Some nodded in agreement while others wiped away tears. Even the most skeptical among them seemed to be reconsidering their views. I stand before you today, not just as your colleague, but as someone who has seen the light, Miss Adams concluded. I'm asking you to join me in making our school a place where every child feels valued and supported. Together, we can create an environment where all students can thrive. The room erupted in applause as Ms. Adams finished speaking. Several teachers approached her afterward, eager to learn more about her experiences and the inclusive practices she had mentioned. In the weeks that followed Miss Adams' transformation, the atmosphere in her classroom changed dramatically. Mary, who had once shrunk in his seat to avoid attention, now sat up straight, his eyes bright with newfound confidence. Miss Adams approached Mary's desk one morning, a warm smile on her face. How are you doing today, Marky? She asked gently. I'm great, Miss Adams, Mary replied, his voice filled with enthusiasm. I finished that book you recommended. It was amazing. Miss Adams beamed with pride. That's wonderful. Would you like to share your thoughts with the class later? Marky nodded eagerly, no longer afraid to speak up in front of his peers. As the days passed, Mary's academic performance began to soar. With the new support programs in place and Ms. Adams's patient guidance, he found himself tackling challenges he once thought impossible. His test scores improved, and he started raising his hand more often to answer questions during group projects. Mary's classmates no longer hesitated to include him. Instead, they sought out his ideas and contributions. Amy, his longtime friend, noticed the change in Mary. You're really on fire lately, she said to him one day during lunch. It's like you're a whole new person. Marky smiled shyly. I just feel I don't know, more like I belong now, like I can do anything if I try hard enough. The other students at the table nodded in agreement. They had all noticed the positive changes in their classroom and in Mary. Adams watched from across the cafeteria, her heart swelling with emotion. She saw Mary laughing with his friends, fully engaged in conversation. It was a far cry from the isolated boy she had once unfairly labeled as a burden in class. Mary's hand shot up during a particularly challenging math problem. Adams called on him and he wheeled himself to the front of the room. I think I know how to solve this, he said, his voice steady and confident as Mary explained his solution. Miss Adams felt a lump form in her throat. She remembered a time when she would have dismissed his ATT, assuming he couldn't keep up. Now she listened intently, nodding encouragingly as he worked through the problem. When Mary finished, the class erupted in applause. His solution was spot on, and even some of the top students looked impressed. Excellent work, Mary, Miss Adams exclaimed. You've really grasped this concept. Would you mind helping some of your classmates who might be struggling? Mary's face lit up. I'd love to, Miss Adams, as Mar moved around the room offering assistance to his peers. Adams felt a profound sense of pride and gratitude. She watched as students who once avoided Mary now eagerly sought his help, treating him with respect and admiration. The classroom had become a supportive and positive environment where every student felt valued and capable. Mary's growth and success had become a powerful symbol of what could be achieved through empathy, understanding, and the right support. As the school year drew to a close, Miss Adams found herself sitting at her desk surrounded by the colorful artwork and projects her students had created. She gazed around the classroom, her eyes lingering on Mary's empty desk. A wave of emotion washed over her as she reflected on the incredible journey of the past few months. Miss Adams closed her eyes, remembering the harsh words she had once spoken to Mary. The memory stung, but it also served as a powerful reminder of how far she had come. Her time at the Disability Center had opened her eyes to a world she had never truly understood before. She thought of Malik, the young boy who had taught her so much about resilience and determination. Grace Valera's face came to mind, and Miss Adams felt a surge of gratitude. Grace's compassion and willingness to give her a second chance had been the catalyst for her transformation. Instead of demanding punishment, Grace had offered an opportunity for growth and redemption. It was a lesson in forgiveness that Ms. Adams would carry with her always. As she looked around the classroom once more, Adams realized that it was no longer Just a room where she taught lessons, it had become a place of inclusion, support, and understanding. The new programs implemented with Grace's help had changed the entire school culture. Students with disabilities were no longer seen as burdens or obstacles, but as valued members of the community with unique perspectives to offer. Miss Adams thought about Mary's progress throughout the year. She remembered the shy, withdrawn boy he had once been and marveled at the confident, enthusiastic student he had become. His success was a testament to what could be achieved when educators approached their students with empathy and patience. A sense of deep fulfillment settled over M. Adams. She realized that her journey had not only made her a better teacher but a better person as well. The compassion she had learned to extend to her students had seeped into every aspect of her life, making her more understanding and patient in all her interactions. As she packed up her belongings for the summer, M. Adams felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was committed to continuing her work as an advocate for inclusivity and compassion in education. She vowed to herself that no student under her care would ever feel the way Mary once had, isolated, humiliated, or undervalued. Miss Adams knew that her journey was far from over. There would always be more to learn, more ways to improve, and more students who needed her support. But she was ready for the challenge, armed with the lessons she had learned and the transformative power of empathy. As the new initiatives took root within the school's culture, it became clear that changes were needed on the physical grounds as well. The school board, inspired by the success of the inclusion programs, allocated additional funds for renovations to make the campus more accessible for students with disabilities like Mary. Construction crews arrived during the summer break and the school grounds bustled with activity. The first order of business was installing ramps alongside staircases, ensuring that wheelchair users could easily access all areas of the school. Smooth, gently sloping paths replaced uneven walkways, making it safer and more comfortable for students with mobility issues to navigate the campus. Inside the buildings, workers widened doorways and installed automatic door openers. These seemingly small changes made a world of difference for students like Mary, who could now enter classrooms independently without struggling with heavy doors. The bathrooms underwent significant renovations. 2 spacious wheelchair-accessible stalls were added, complete with grab bars and lowered sinks for students with visual impairments. Braille signage was installed throughout the school in the classrooms. Adjustable height desks were brought in, allowing students in wheelchairs to sit comfortably alongside their peers. The science lab saw the addition of lowered workstations, ensuring that all students could participate fully in experiments and hands-on learning activities. The school library wasn't forgotten either. Wide aisles between bookshelves made it easy for wheelchair users to browse, while a selection of audiobooks and large print books was added for students with visual impairment. Perhaps the most exciting change for many students was the renovation of the playground. New equipment was installed that could be enjoyed by children of all abilities. There were wheelchair-accessible swings, sensory play areas for students with autism, and ground-level play structures that didn't require climbing. When the students returned for the new school year, they were amazed by the transformation. Mary's face lit up as he easily maneuvered his wheelchair up the new ramps and through the wide hallways. For the first time, he felt truly independent at school. "This is awesome," Mary exclaimed to his friend Jake as they explored the renovated campus together. "I can go anywhere I want now, just like everyone else." Miss Adams watched with a warm smile as Mary and his classmates enjoyed the new facilities. She felt a sense of pride knowing that she had played a part in making these changes happen. The physical renovations combined with the new inclusive programs had truly transformed the school into a welcoming place for all students. If you enjoyed the story of Miss Adams and Markey, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.